From Brandstar Studio at Florida Atlantic University, I'm Dr. Kevin Wagner, the co-director of the Political Communication Laboratory.
And I'm Antonio Fins, politics editor at the Palm Beach Post.
Today we're going to discuss our new poll of public opinion here in the United States about the presidential election, how people feel about democracy, and even how happy they are right now. So come along with us and take a look at some of our insights.
All right, Kevin, the first slide here, you have the vice president ahead of the former president by 4 points. Tell us about why.
Yeah, so this poll was taken immediately after the convention, so we started collecting on the Friday after the convention through the weekend, and so probably some of what you're seeing here is what we call a convention bounce, which is when the enthusiasm for the candidate that just had their convention, their voters tend to respond to polls a little more frequently and with a little more enthusiasm, and so you can see what we call a bounce, which is a push up in their numbers. Whether or not that's sustainable, we can't really know at this point, but it's certainly, you know, if you're having a convention, you definitely want to have a bounce.
All right, but one question though, this is a sample size that back in 2020, Biden was up by 6 points. Is the Vice President Harris underperforming, or are we making too much of that?
A little bit hard to say that at this point because remember, there's always a margin of error in a poll. So, you know, our margin of error here is about 3 points. So she could in fact be 3 points higher, or it could be even tighter. She could be 3 points lower, right? The margin works in both directions. So it's too hard to say whether or not she's ahead of where Biden is at this point. But, you know, I'm certain that the vice president is happy to be ahead, at least in some of these numbers, especially right after the convention.
All right, so one of the reasons the vice president is up is the gender gap. And quite frankly, the numbers speak for themselves. Tell us about what you found.
Yeah, I don't know that they speak for themselves, but they certainly tell us something, right? And one of the things that has been true for many presidential cycles is that Democrats tend to do better with women voters. Earlier in this election cycle, it didn't seem like there was this big a gender gap. And one of the things that's most pronounced in these numbers, Antonio, is you can see the return of that big gender gap. And you can see the vice president well ahead, especially among women voters. The reverse is also true, which is the former president is ahead among men, but notice that that gap is much, much tighter, and that's part of the reason that at least in these numbers we can see the vice president being ahead.
All right, Kevin, so one of the things that President Trump has talked a lot about is that he's doing extraordinarily well with Latinos. However, you found something a bit different.
Yeah, at least in our numbers here, and especially right after the convention, you can see that the vice president has actually established a lead among black voters, among Latino voters, and this is part of a traditional Democratic coalition where Democrats tend to be strong, and some of that was certainly lagging when Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket. And you can see one of the strengths of the vice president, at least when it comes to this election, is that she's restored some of that gap again. And you can see her strength among black voters, among Latino voters, and among college-educated white voters as well. So the elements of the traditional Democratic coalition forming together.
But the element of the classic Trump coalition is also holding, which is that he's doing extremely well with white, non-college educated voters.
Yeah, he's doing very well with them, and in fact, in some of these numbers, he's doing better than he has even in previous elections. Again, you know, defining to some degree what has become sort of the natural divide in our electorate between sort of these white, non-college educated voters and, of course, the white college educated voters who are going in very different directions, and we can see that very clearly in these numbers.
All right, Kevin, so it looks like the dominating emotions right now in this 2024 election season is fear and excitement. What'd you find?
Yeah, I guess it's if you actually add up the numbers, it comes out pretty evenly between negative emotions and positive emotions, which, you know, is kind of surprising, right? So you have a real dichotomy here with a lot of voters being angry and afraid, and of course a good number of voters also being excited and joyful. The distinction between those is pretty important, but you know, they do have some similarities in some basic sense, which is when you're excited or even when you're fearful, when you have high intense emotions, you tend to be more engaged in the political environment and you tend more likely to turn out. So it's not surprising that that voters are displaying these emotions, but it is an interesting contrast that you have such stark different kinds of emotions that are motivating voters now.
But it does suggest either way that this could be a high turnout election. Those are two motivators to get people to the polls.
Yeah, negative emotions and positive emotions, when they're intense, tend to lead to turnout. And so I think one of the biggest indicators here, I think you're absolutely right, it does suggest that voters are engaged in this race, they care about this race, whether it's negative or positively, and they're likely to turn out in November.
So on Wall Street, it said that what drives people is fear and greed. In politics today, apparently it's fear, but also joy and excitement, but not evenly distributed among Republicans and Democrats. Tell us about the partisan breakdowns in these differing emotions.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting dichotomy here, and it's interesting to see whether this will hold up long term. You can see, from our numbers that the joy and the excitement seem to favor the Democrats, at least in our numbers. Some of that is clearly because the Democratic convention was most recent, right? And so you had a lot of joy and excitement that followed that, and you can see that reflected in how Democrats are seeing this race. Republicans are more likely to indicate fear, and that has a little bit to do how the Republican ticket has approached this race as well. Whether that holds up during the course of the election, we'll have to see, but certainly right now you're seeing a lot more of the joy and excitement on the Democratic side.
All right, so for all the talk about social media, you found that the number one places where people are getting their news and watching the election coverage is traditional cable TV news and what we consider legacy TV news, which is the networks. Talk about it.
I think the death of television news and the importance of television news or even cable news has been greatly exaggerated. In this particular case, you can see that people are still relying on television, they're still relying on cable news, but it's also important to point out that there's an increasing segment of voters that are relying on social media, that are relying on websites and blogs and podcasts. I think one of the things that we can take away from these numbers in particular is that there is a wide variety of ways that people consume information, and sometimes they consume it in very, very different ways. And a good campaign these days has to figure out how to reach different voters in these different environments.
And it could be, too, that the 20% that are watching or reading online, reading social media, listening to podcasts, may well be skewed toward a younger population, which is how you would reach them.
Yeah, and especially you have to think about who you're targeting when you're advertising in these mediums or when you're appearing in these mediums, and that's why you see the campaigns in particular are trying to use social media platforms, and you see them, especially at the convention. One of the sort of big talks of the recent convention was this focus on trying to get social media developers and people that appear on social media to cover the convention, because that might be the only way to reach some of these voters, especially some of these younger voters.
Well, this is kind of an interesting slide. The number of people that believe that democracy works in the U.S. is much higher than those significantly higher than those who don't, 46 to 38%. There's a gap there. However, that 46% that believes that democracy is working isn't breaking 50%. So there's reason for concern and some relief. Your view?
Yeah, one of the things that we like to do here, Antonio, especially here at Florida Atlantic University, is to measure some of these aspects of civics and democracy. And this is one of those slides where we're taking a look at what people think about the democratic process, especially related to the election. I think the good news is that the plurality seems to think that our democracy is working, but the more challenging aspect of this is there's a significant number of voters who look at our system and are dissatisfied with it. Dissatisfaction is a pretty significant number here, about 38% roughly. That's a big number, and it does suggest that many Americans are looking at the system and saying, it's not working for me, and that's something that we can't really ignore.
All right, Kevin, let's break down the numbers a bit here on this question of democracy and satisfaction. So when we look at the partisan breakdown, just over 50% of Republicans are dissatisfied with the way democracy is working to varying degrees, whereas just over 60% of Democrats are satisfied with the way democracy is working. So there is, again, another partisan gap here in the way they view how the system is working.
Yeah, some of this is no doubt a convention bounce for the Democrats. So you just had what was widely considered a successful convention for the Democrats, especially among the Democratic base. They're happy, they're excited. We saw that in some of our other data. You can see even some of them are joyous, and we saw some of that data. And I think that's what's translating here, and you're seeing them being more satisfied. They like their candidate, they like the way that this race is starting to develop, and so you're seeing that reflected here. On the contrast, you're seeing a dissatisfaction among Republican voters who maybe don't like the fact that the Democrats changed candidates. They may have taken the messaging that the election is not being done fairly, and you're seeing that reflected here as well. The fact that there's such a stark partisan difference here, though, is a bit troubling to me. From Brandstar Studio at Florida Atlantic University, I'm Dr. Kevin Wagner.
And I'm Antonio Fins, politics editor at the Palm Beach Post.
If you like the work that we're doing here, or you enjoyed our analysis and want to continue receiving it, please take a moment to press like and subscribe and share the content with your friends and family. Thank you.